Marlene Warren. On the morning of May 26, 1990, a clown showed up at Marlene Warren's front door. Not for a birthday party and not as a prank. This clown was standing on the porch of her home in the Aero Club community of Wellington, Florida, holding a bouquet of carnations and 2 balloons, one silver with the words, "You're the greatest," and the other printed with an image of Snow White. Marlene was 40 years old, married to a used car dealer named Michael Warren, and she had no reason to think that anything was wrong. Her 21-year-old son Joseph and a few of his friends were inside the house eating breakfast. It was a Saturday morning. She opened the door, looked at the flowers and the balloons, and smiled. She reportedly said something along the lines of how nice the gesture was. And then the clown raised a handgun and shot her point blank in the face. Without a word, the figure turned around, walked back to a white Chrysler LeBaron parked nearby, and drove off. Marlene was rushed to the hospital. She never regained consciousness, and she died 2 days later. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Sheila Keene, a woman who worked for Michael Warren repossessing cars. Multiple witnesses described the two of them as being romantically involved, though both denied having an affair. A costume shop employee named Deborah Offord came forward and identified Sheila as the woman who had come into the store 2 nights before the murder, insisting on purchasing a clown costume even though the shop had already closed for the evening. The balloons were traced to a public supermarket near Sheila's home, and the white Chrysler LeBaron used as the getaway vehicle turned out to have been reported stolen from Michael Warren's own car lot. When police recovered the vehicle, they found orange fibers inside that were consistent with synthetic wig hair. It was a significant web of circumstantial evidence: the costume purchase, the balloons, the stolen car from her lover's business, the fibers. But prosecutors did not feel they had enough to bring charges. The case went cold. And then something happened that made investigators feel sick. Sheila Keene and Michael Warren got married in 2002, 12 years after Marlene's murder. They relocated to Abingdon, Virginia, opened a restaurant together, and lived quietly as husband and wife. For 15 more years, they built a life while Marlene's killing remained unsolved. The break came with advances in forensic science. Hairs that had been recovered from the getaway car were subjected to improved DNA testing, and the results pointed directly to Sheila. In September of 2017, 27 years after the murder, Sheila Keene Warren was arrested and charged. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, then adjusted their strategy and pursued life in prison. But on April the 25th, 2023, just 2 weeks before her trial was set to begin, Sheila pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 12-year sentence with credit for time already served. In a detail that baffled observers, she maintained her innocence even while entering the guilty plea, admitting to the crime while simultaneously insisting she did not commit it. She was released from prison in November of 2024. Michael Warren was never charged in connection with Marlene's death, though he had been separately convicted back in 1994 of fraud, racketeering, and odometer tampering. A woman murdered at her own front door by someone dressed as a clown. A case that stayed open for nearly 3 decades, while the prime suspect married the victim's husband and lived freely in another state. And then, a guilty plea that came with the strangest caveat imaginable: an admission of responsibility paired with a simultaneous denial that she had done anything wrong. Sheila Keene Warren walked out of prison having served a fraction of a life sentence, and Marlene Warren's family was left to accept that this was the closest thing to justice they would ever get. The whole thing leaves you with a feeling that is hard to shake, that the most unsettling part of a murder is not always the killing itself. Sometimes it is what happens in the years that follow, when the people responsible go on living as though nothing happened at all. Speaking of people hiding behind fame and money, the next case involves a legendary music producer, a struggling actress, and a hilltop mansion that the locals called a castle. Lana Clarkson. Lana Clarkson had spent her entire adult life trying to build a career in Hollywood. And for a stretch in the 1980s, it looked like she might actually pull it off. She landed the lead in Roger Corman's 1985 B-movie Barbarian Queen and had appeared in Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Scarface. She seemed to be on the edge of something bigger. But Hollywood is brutal to women as they age. And by 2003, at 40 years old, the roles had dried up. Lana was working as a VIP hostess at the House of Blues on the Sunset Strip. Greeting guests, managing the velvet rope, making the best of a career that had not gone the way she had planned. It was not the life she envisioned, but she showed up every shift and she did her job. On the night of February 2nd, 2003, a 62-year-old man walked into the House of Blues, and Lana was assigned to attend to him. His name was Phil Spector. In the world of popular music, Spector was royalty. He had invented what people called the wall of sound, that dense orchestral production technique that had defined pop records in the 1960s. He had produced the Ronettes, worked with Ike and Tina Turner, and handled solo albums for individual members of the Beatles. He was also widely known for something darker: decades of erratic, controlling, and threatening behavior, especially toward women. Lana left the House of Blues with Spector that night and accompanied him back to his estate in Alhambra, a massive hilltop property that the locals had nicknamed Pyrenees Castle. His Brazilian chauffeur, Adriano de Souza, drove them there and then waited in the car outside. Sometime around 5 in the morning, de Souza heard a loud bang from inside the house. Moments later, Phil Spector walked out through the front door with a revolver in his hand. According to de Souza's testimony at trial, Spector stated that he believed he had killed somebody, and then shrugged, as if the information barely registered. When police arrived, they found Lana Clarkson dead in the foyer, slumped in a chair. She had been shot once through the mouth with a Colt Cobra .38 caliber revolver. The defense team built their case around suicide. They argued that Lana was a woman overwhelmed by depression and a failing career, and that she had picked up the weapon herself. The prosecution demolished this theory. 5 separate women took the stand and testified that Phil Spector had threatened them with firearms over the years. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had made a habit of terrorizing women with guns, a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades. This was not an isolated incident, they argued. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life spent using power and violence to control the people around him. Spector's first trial in 2007 ended in a mistrial when the jury split 10-2 in favor of conviction. A second trial was held, and on April 13, 2009, the jury returned a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. On May 29, 2009, Phil Spector was sentenced to 19 years to life in state prison. He never walked free again. On January 16, 2021, he died in prison of complications related to COVID-19. He was 81 years old. Lana Clarkson deserved so much more than the way her story ended. Reduced to a footnote in someone else's fame, remembered more for the man who killed her than for the life she had built on her own terms. She walked into a castle on what was supposed to be a casual night out, and she never walked out alive. Her family spent years reminding the public that she was more than a crime scene, that she was a woman with warmth and ambitions, and a career she had fought hard for. Phil Spector proved that genius, celebrity, and wealth do not make a person safe to be around. In his case, those things made him far more dangerous, because they gave him the power to believe he could do whatever he wanted and never face consequences. If the Spector case showed what can happen when a stranger with money invites you home, the next story proves that the danger does not always come from the outside. Sometimes it is already sleeping in your bed, quietly planning your disappearance with surgical precision. Bill McGuire. On April 28, 2004, Bill and Melanie McGuire closed on their very first house together. It should have been one of the happiest days of their marriage. Bill was 39 years old, a United States Navy veteran who had transitioned into a career as a computer program analyst. Melanie worked as a nurse at a fertility clinic in New Jersey. They had 2 young sons. From the outside, this was a family planting roots and building toward something good. But according to prosecutors, by the time the closing documents were signed, Melanie had already decided that her husband would never set foot in their new home. That same night, investigators believe Melanie drugged Bill with chloral hydrate, a potent sedative, and then shot him with a .38 caliber handgun. What came next was methodical and stomach-turning. She dismembered his body using a knife and a reciprocating saw. Over the following days, she packed his remains into 3 matching Kenneth Cole suitcases and transported them south. Between May 5th and May 16th, 2004, those suitcases washed ashore along the Chesapeake Bay, near Virginia Beach, Virginia, one after the other, each containing a portion of a man who had just signed the mortgage on his first home. The motive, prosecutors argued, was another man. Melanie had been having an affair for roughly 2 years with her boss at the fertility clinic, a doctor named Bradley Miller. She wanted a clean break, a new life with Miller without the complications of a messy divorce that could threaten custody of her children and divide their finances. Rather than hire a lawyer and fight it out in court, she chose a far more permanent solution. The trail of evidence she left behind was staggering in both its breadth and its apparent carelessness for someone who had planned so carefully. 2 days before Bill's death, she purchased a .38 caliber handgun at a store in Pennsylvania. She forged a prescription for chloral hydrate using a prescription pad that belonged to Dr. Miller. Her computer search history contained queries about how to commit murder, how to obtain undetectable poisons, and how to acquire a firearm without being traced. Her EZ Pass toll records placed her vehicle heading south on the highway toward Delaware, around the time the suitcases would have been disposed of. Garbage bags found wrapped around the remains matched bags from the McGuire's apartment. A medical-grade blanket recovered from one of the suitcases was linked directly to the fertility clinic where she worked. And inside Bill's abandoned car, forensic investigators discovered tiny particles of human tissue. Biological residue that one journalist described as what remains after a body has been cut apart with power tools. Melanie was arrested in June of 2005. On April 23, 2007, a jury convicted her of first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, perjury, and unlawful possession of a firearm. On July 19, 2007, she was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 5 years, with no eligibility for parole until she reaches approximately 100 years of age. She continues to maintain her innocence. Every appeal she has filed has been denied. A fertility nurse who searched the internet for a step-by-step murder playbook and then followed it almost to the letter. Designer luggage used as body bags. Human tissue found in the trunk of a car. And a man's remains washing up on a beach inside matching Kenneth Cole suitcases over the course of 11 days. like some grotesque set of lost luggage that the ocean kept trying to return. Bill McGuire had just signed the biggest financial commitment of his life, and his wife had already decided he would not live long enough to unpack a single box. The most dangerous person in your life might not be a stranger lurking outside. It might be the person lying next to you in bed, promising a fresh start while quietly making sure you never get one. And if a nurse with a reciprocating saw and a damning search history feels like the most calculated killer on this list, the next case raises the bar even further, because it involves a certified genius, a rare poison that most doctors had never even heard of, and an undercover detective who moved into the killer's own house to build a case against him. Peggy Carr. In October of 1988, a 41-year-old waitress named Peggy Carr started getting sick at her home in Alturas, Florida, a small, quiet community in Polk County where not much ever happened. At first, the symptoms seemed like a nasty flu. She felt nauseous, weak, and had a burning pain that radiated through her body. But then her son Dwayne began to feel the same way. And then her stepson Travis. And then other people living in the household started developing similar symptoms. Doctors ran test after test and could not figure out what was happening. It did not behave like a virus. It did not match food poisoning. Whatever was attacking this family, it was something none of the local physicians had seen before. The answer, when it finally came, was horrifying. Laboratory analysis revealed that Peggy Carr's urine contained 20,000 times the normal amount of thallium, a toxic heavy metal that had once been widely used in rat poison before being banned for consumer use. Thallium is colorless, odorless, and nearly tasteless when dissolved. It attacks the nervous system, causes searing pain throughout the body, leads to hair loss, and in large enough doses, it kills. Slowly and agonizingly. Peggy deteriorated for months. She slipped into a coma and never recovered. On March 3rd, 1989, she was taken off life support and pronounced dead. 6 other members of her household had been poisoned as well, but they survived. The investigation revealed that someone had laced bottles of Coca-Cola inside the Carr family's home with thallium. A witness later recalled seeing the suspect in possession of a bottle recapping device, a specialized tool that could reseal a soda bottle after its contents had been tampered with, making it look untouched. Before the poisonings began, the family had received a menacing anonymous note typed on a yellow Post-it. The note warned them that they and their family had 2 weeks to leave Florida permanently, or they would all die. The note stressed that it was not a joke. Suspicion quickly settled on the Carr's next-door neighbor, a man named George Trepal. He was a chemist by training, a convicted former methamphetamine manufacturer, and a proud member of Mensa, the International High IQ Society. He and the Carrs had been in an escalating dispute for months, mostly over noise from the Carr household. When detectives interviewed Trepal early in the case, he offered an oddly revealing theory, suggesting that whoever poisoned the family probably just wanted them to move away. It was the kind of observation that sounded less like speculation and more like first-hand knowledge. The case took a remarkable turn when a Polk County Sheriff's detective named Susan Gorick went deep undercover. She befriended George Trepal, integrated herself into his social circle, and even attended a Mensa-organized murder mystery weekend alongside him. Eventually, she maneuvered herself into renting Trepal's own house when he temporarily relocated. While living there, investigators conducted a thorough search of the property and discovered a bottle of thallium concealed in the garage. The same poison that had killed Peggy Carr and sickened her entire family. In 1991, George Trepal was tried and convicted of first-degree murder 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and product tampering. The jury recommended a death sentence by a vote of 9-3, and the judge imposed it. Treppel remains on Florida's death row today. His appeals, including challenges to the credibility of an FBI chemist whose testimony had been questioned in other federal cases, have all been denied. A Mensa member who poisoned his neighbor's soda bottles because they made too much noise. A toxic heavy metal so obscure that the emergency room doctors treating Peggy Carr had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with for weeks. And a female detective who literally moved into the killer's own home and lived under his roof to build the case that would ultimately put him on death row. The story of Peggy Carr is one of those cases that sounds too outlandish to be real, too layered to have happened in a small town in Central Florida, except that every single detail of it was proven in a courtroom. But if a genius chemist with a neighborhood grudge sounds extreme, the next case shows that lethal brilliance can also hide behind a medical degree, a prestigious university title, and a glass of something offered with what looked like love. Autumn Klein. Dr. Autumn Klein was, by every measure, one of the most accomplished physicians in her field. She graduated magna cum laude from Amherst College, earned both her MD and her PhD from Boston University, and completed her residency and fellowship at Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. By the age of 41, she held the position of Chief of Women's Neurology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and was recognized nationally as an expert in epilepsy and pregnancy, a niche specialty where her research had earned national recognition. Colleagues described her as brilliant and tireless. Patients trusted her completely. She was also a devoted mother to a young daughter. And by the spring of 2013, she and her husband were talking about having a second child. Her husband was Dr. Robert Ferrante, who was 64 at the time. Ferrante worked as a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, specializing in ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Earlier in his career, Ferrante had been well regarded in his field, but by 2013, his work had slowed while Autumn's reputation was still rising. The dynamic between them, prosecutors would later argue, had shifted in ways that Ferrante found threatening. He was aging out of his prime years in research, just as his wife was entering hers. In the days before Autumn's death, Ferrante encouraged her to start taking a creatine supplement. He told her it could boost her fertility and help her conceive again. He mixed the creatine into a flavored drink and gave it to her himself. Autumn, who had no reason to doubt her husband, drank it willingly. On April 17, 2013, Autumn collapsed at their home in Pittsburgh. She was rushed to the hospital, but her condition worsened rapidly. 3 days later, on April 20th, she was pronounced dead. She was 41 years old. Investigators uncovered a damning timeline. On April 15th, just 2 days before Autumn collapsed, Robert Ferrante had used a University of Pittsburgh credit card to order a 250-gram bottle of potassium cyanide. He had it shipped overnight to his laboratory in Scaife Hall on the university campus. When forensic investigators examined the bottle, they discovered that 8.3 grams of cyanide were missing from the container. A toxicology report performed by Quest Diagnostics confirmed that Autumn Klein's blood contained lethal concentrations of cyanide. The poison had been in the drink her husband gave her. The digital evidence made things worse for Ferrante. His internet search history revealed queries about cyanide poisoning, how quickly it kills, how it affects the human body, and whether it can be detected in a toxicology screen after death. His account of the evening, Autumn collapsed, shifted between interviews. with inconsistencies about where he was in the house and how quickly he sought help. Prosecutors laid out a motive rooted in jealousy and insecurity. They argued that Ferrante resented his wife's flourishing career as his own was declining, that he feared she would leave him, and that the prospect of a second child represented a further shift in household power that he could not accept. On November 7, 2014, Robert Ferrante was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was formally sentenced in February of 2015 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He launched multiple appeals, including one unusual argument claiming that a patient who received Autumn's donated liver showed no signs of cyanide toxicity, which he said proved the poison had not killed her. The court rejected it. Every appeal has failed. Two doctors at the very top of their professions, a marriage that looked pristine from the outside, and a so-called fertility drink that was laced with one of the most recognizable poisons in human history. Ordered on a university credit card with a paper trail a mile long, shipped overnight to the killer's own laboratory, and handed across the kitchen counter to the woman who trusted him most in the world. What happened to Autumn Klein will stay with anyone who hears it, because it strips away every assumption about safety, trust, and the people we let closest to us. Sometimes the person who promises to take care of you is the very person you should be most afraid of. And the most dangerous lies are not the ones told by strangers, but the ones wrapped carefully in something that looks and feels exactly like love. If you are enjoying this video and you have not subscribed yet, take a second and hit that subscribe button. It is a small thing that makes a big difference in helping this channel grow. Lynette Dawson. On or around January 8, 1982, a 33-year-old nurse and childcare worker named Lynette Dawson vanished from her home in Bayview, on the northern beaches of Sydney, Australia. She left behind two young daughters and a husband who did not seem particularly concerned about her absence. That husband was Chris Dawson, a former professional rugby league player for the Newtown Jets, who had settled into a career as a physical education teacher at a local high school. When people asked where his wife had gone, Dawson told them she had simply left, that she had walked away from the family on her own and chosen not to come back. For a long time, people believed him. But Lynette had not walked away. She had not contacted her mother, her sister, her closest friends, or anyone who had ever meant anything to her. She left behind her belongings, her bank accounts, her children, everything a person would take with them if they were truly starting over somewhere else. And while she was gone, Chris Dawson moved someone new into the house almost immediately. A 16-year-old former student of his and the family's babysitter, a girl known in court as JC and later publicly identified as Joanne Curtis. Dawson had been obsessed with the teenager while still married to Lynette, carrying on a relationship with a minor who was under his supervision at school. Within a short time after his wife's disappearance, he and Curtis were living together openly. He eventually married her. Lynette's body has never been found. 3 separate police investigations looked into the case over the following decades, and 2 coronial inquests, one in 2001 and another in 2003. Both recommended that criminal charges be brought against Chris Dawson. But nothing happened. Prosecutors declined to move forward, and the case sat in bureaucratic limbo while Dawson continued to live as a free man in the community. Then, in 2018, an investigative journalist named Hedley Thomas from the Australian newspaper launched a podcast called The Teacher's Pet. The series dug into the case with painstaking detail over dozens of episodes, interviewing witnesses, former students, colleagues, and people who had known the Dawsons personally. It became a phenomenon. one of the most downloaded podcasts in the world. By 2020, it had been listened to close to 30 million times and topped podcast charts in Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand. The wave of public pressure it generated was impossible for authorities to ignore, and a fresh police investigation was launched. In December of 2018, Chris Dawson was finally charged with the murder of his wife. Because of the intense pretrial publicity, a judge-alone trial was held with no jury. On August 30th, 2022, Justice Ian Harrison delivered his verdict. He found Chris Dawson guilty of murder, concluding that Dawson had killed Lynette for the selfish and cynical purpose of pursuing an unobstructed relationship with his teenage student. The judge described his treatment of Lynette as self-indulgent brutality and said he had viewed her as completely dispensable. On December 2nd, 2022, Dawson was sentenced to 24 years in prison with an 18-year non-parole period. The sentencing judge noted that Dawson would probably die behind bars. His appeal was dismissed in June of 2024. 40 years. That is how long it took for someone to be held accountable for what happened to Lynette Dawson. It took a podcast, not a police task force, not a prosecutor, not any of the 3 formal investigations that had looked at the case, to finally generate enough public pressure to force the system to act. Lynette's body has never been recovered. Her daughters grew up without their mother, raised by the man who killed her and the teenager he replaced her with. And Chris Dawson walked free for nearly 4 decades, building a comfortable life in plain sight, before a journalist with a microphone accomplished what 3 separate investigations could not. If Lynette Dawson's case shows what happens when a system fails to act for decades, the next one reveals what happens when a single decision, made in a fog of drugs and alcohol on a dark road in Texas, turns into something far worse than an accident, because the person behind the wheel chose to let a man die rather than pick up a phone. Gregory Glenn Biggs. On the night of October 26, 2001, a 25-year-old nurse's aide named Shante Jawan Mallard was driving home through Fort Worth, Texas. She had been drinking heavily, and she had taken ecstasy and smoked marijuana earlier that evening. Somewhere on a darkened stretch of road, she struck a man with her car. The impact was catastrophic. The man's body came crashing through the windshield and lodged there, his torso inside the vehicle, his legs hanging outside, his left leg nearly severed. He was alive, conscious, and trapped in the shattered glass. The man trapped in the glass was Gregory Glenn Biggs. He was 37 years old, a former bricklayer and mason who had fallen on hard times. He was living on the streets and struggling with bipolar disorder and mild schizophrenia. He had been walking along the roadside when Mallard's car hit him at full speed. What Mallard did next is what turned a terrible accident into a murder charge. She did not stop. She did not call 911. She did not flag down another car or drive to the nearest hospital. Instead, she drove the rest of the way home with Biggs still embedded in her windshield, pulled her car into the attached garage, and closed the door behind her. According to testimony at trial, she sat in the car for a period of time, crying and apologizing to the injured man stuck in the shattered glass in front of her. But at no point did she pick up a phone. At no point did she knock on a neighbor's door. She left Gregory Biggs in that garage, wedged in broken glass, bleeding out slowly and suffering, and she went inside her house. Over the course of the next several hours, while Mallard was inside, Gregory Biggs died, alone, in the dark, in a stranger's garage, trapped in the windshield of the car that had hit him. Medical testimony at trial was devastating. The Tarrant County medical examiner and a fire department captain both stated that Biggs would have survived his injuries if he had received prompt medical attention. A member of the Fort Worth Fire Department testified that there was not a firefighter in the city who could not have saved that man's life if they had been called to the scene. After Biggs died, Mallard needed to get rid of the body. She enlisted her former boyfriend, Cleet Jackson, and his cousin Herbert Tyrone Cleveland to help. The three of them moved the body out of the car and dumped it in Cobb Park, a public area in Fort Worth. Mallard had suggested burning the body, but Jackson refused. He reportedly told her they should leave it somewhere his family could find him and give him a burial. For 4 months, no one knew what had happened. Then Mallard made a fatal mistake. She attended a party and, according to witnesses, began talking about what she had done. She was not confessing out of guilt. She was laughing about it. A tipster at the gathering contacted the police, and investigators found Mallard's car still stained with blood. They also found that she had burned the passenger seat in an attempt to destroy evidence. On June 27, 2003, Shante Mallard was convicted of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison, plus 10 years for evidence tampering to be served concurrently. She is eligible for parole in 2027. Cleet Jackson received 10 years, and Herbert Cleveland received 9 for their roles in disposing of the body. In a moment that drew national attention, Gregory Biggs's son Brandon publicly forgave Mallard. A gesture of grace that stood in stark contrast to the cruelty she had shown his father, a man who survived being hit by a car and driven home in a windshield, a woman who chose to let him die rather than face a drunk driving charge, and a party where she laughed about it until someone in the room decided to call the police. The Gregory Biggs case was so shocking and so strange that it inspired the 2007 film Stuck and Elements of a subplot in the television series Fargo. Some cases shock you because of how elaborate the crime is. The next one is unsettling for a different reason. Because of what the killer allegedly did with the bodies after the murders were over. Kathy Magaziner and Kimberly Spicer. In Baltimore, Maryland, during the mid-1990s, a man named Joseph Roy Matheny was working at a pallet yard on the industrial outskirts of the city. People who knew him called him Tiny, a darkly ironic nickname for a man who stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed somewhere around 450 pounds. He was a heavy drug user, a violent presence in the neighborhood, and he moved through life with a menace that made the people around him deeply uncomfortable. He would eventually become one of the most disturbing killers in the history of the state of Maryland. Not because of the number of people he killed, but because of what he claimed to have done with his victims' bodies after they were dead. His first confirmed victim was Kathy Ann Magaziner, a woman from South Baltimore who was struggling with drug addiction. In 1994, Matheny strangled her and buried her body at the pallet yard where he worked. Sometime later, he returned to the burial site, dug up her body, decapitated her, reburied the torso, and threw the skull in the trash. Magaziner was later identified through dental records. She was reported to have been between 39 and 45 years old at the time of her death. His second confirmed victim was Kimberly Lynn Spicer, a woman in her early to mid-20s. In November of 1996, Matheny killed her by stabbing and concealed her body beneath trailers and wooden pallets at the same yard. He was caught in December of 1996 after he made the decision to show Spicer's body to a co-worker, apparently as a boast or a display of power. That co-worker went straight to the police. Just days earlier, Matheny had kidnapped a woman named Rita Kemper and attempted to assault her inside a trailer. Kemper managed to escape through a window after Matheny allegedly told her he was going to kill her and bury her in the woods alongside the other women he had hidden there. What made Metheny infamous, however, was a claim that went far beyond the murders themselves. After his arrest, he told investigators that he had killed as many as 10 to 13 people in total, and that he had ground the flesh of some of his victims together with pork and beef and sold the mixture as burgers from a small roadside barbecue stand he operated near the pallet yard. The claim was widely reported and became the detail that defined his public reputation. But it is important to note that this was never independently verified. No forensic evidence confirmed that human remains were sold as food, and Metheny was an unreliable narrator with a taste for provocation. Only 2 murders, Magaziners and Spicers, were ever proven in court. His legal outcomes reflected the severity of what was established in court. In 1997, he was convicted of kidnapping and assault in the Kemper case and sentenced to 50 years. In 1998, he was convicted of Spicer's murder and sentenced to death. That same year, he pleaded guilty to Magaziner's murder and received life in prison. His death sentence was later overturned in 2001 because Maryland law required a specific aggravating factor, such as robbery, which prosecutors could not establish. The sentence was reduced to life, without the possibility of parole. On August 5, 2017, Joseph Metheny was found dead in his cell at Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. He was 62 years old. 2 confirmed murders. A confession that stretched into the double digits, but was never corroborated by physical evidence or additional charges. And an allegation so grotesque that he mixed human flesh into burger meat and sold it to unsuspecting customers at a roadside stand. That it permanently attached the word cannibal to his name, whether or not any of it was true. The Metheny case forces a hard question about true crime storytelling itself. How much of what a killer says about himself should be repeated as though it is fact? And how much of it is just another form of cruelty, designed to horrify people and inflate a legacy of violence long after the cell door has closed for good? From a killer who may have served his victims to strangers, we turn now to a case on the other side of the world, where a young man's death was dismissed as a suicide, and it took his brother 35 years to prove otherwise. Scott Johnson. On December 10, 1988, the naked body of a 27-year-old American mathematician named Scott Johnson was found on the rocks at the base of a cliff at Bluefish Point, near Manly, on the northern headland of Sydney Harbour, Australia. His clothes and personal belongings had been left neatly at the top of the cliff. Police looked at the scene, looked at the location, and made their determination quickly. They ruled it a suicide. Scott Johnson had graduated from Cambridge, was pursuing his doctorate at the Australian National University. He was brilliant, driven, and by all accounts deeply engaged in both his academic work and his personal life. He had a partner. He had a future mapped out. His older brother, Steve, a successful tech entrepreneur living in the United States, refused to accept the suicide ruling from the very beginning. He knew Scott. He knew his brother was not someone who would take his own life. And he knew something else, something that the police either did not know or chose not to consider. Bluefish Point was a well-known meeting spot for gay men in Sydney during that era. And throughout the late 1980s, the coastal cliffs around Sydney's northern headlands had been the site of a wave of violent, targeted, homophobic attacks. Gay men had been beaten, chased, and in multiple documented cases thrown from cliff tops by organized gangs. Scott Johnson, who was gay, had gone to Bluefish Point that night. And Steve Johnson was convinced that his brother had been murdered in a hate crime that the police had no interest in investigating. What followed was one of the longest family-driven campaigns for justice in Australian legal history. Steve Johnson spent decades of his life and significant amounts of his own money pressing authorities to reopen the case. A 1989 coronial inquest upheld the suicide finding. A second inquest in 2012 returned an open finding, acknowledging that suicide could not be confirmed, but declining to name a cause. Then, in 2017, a third inquest led by New South Wales coroner Michael Barnes concluded that Scott Johnson had died as a result of a gay hate attack. The finding was a turning point. In 2018, the New South Wales Police offered a $1 million Australian reward for information. Steve Johnson matched it personally, bringing the total to $2 million Australian dollars by 2020. In May of 2020, a man named Scott Philip White was arrested and charged with murder. In January of 2022, White unexpectedly changed his plea to guilty and was convicted. He was sentenced in May of that year to 12 years and 7 months, with a non-parole period of 8 years and 3 months. But the case did not end there. White's murder conviction was overturned on appeal in November of 2022. He subsequently pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter in February of 2023, telling police he had punched Johnson during an argument, causing him to stagger backward and fall from the cliff. He was resentenced in June of 2023 to 9 years in prison, with a 6-year non-parole period, making him eligible for release as early as 2026. The safety of even this conviction has been publicly questioned by legal scholars and journalists. A mathematician whose violent death was written off as a suicide by police who did not want to investigate the obvious. A brother who refused to stop fighting for 35 years, spending his own fortune to drag the truth into the open. A city with a buried history of homophobic cliff attacks that authorities spent decades trying not to acknowledge. And a final conviction that was reduced from murder to manslaughter, publicly contested by legal scholars and journalists, and still leaves more questions than answers about what really happened that night. Scott Johnson was posthumously awarded the doctorate he never got to finish. But the full truth about how he ended up at the bottom of that cliff may never be established beyond dispute. One family's refusal to accept an official story reshaped a case across 3 decades. But the final story in this collection goes somewhere even darker, where the truth is not buried in paperwork or police files, but quite literally beneath the patio of a house in Gloucester, England, hidden by a couple who turned their own home into a graveyard. Heather West. For years, there was a running joke inside the West family household. Whenever someone asked about Heather, the eldest daughter, her parents would laugh and say she was under the patio. Visitors heard it. Family members heard it. Nobody took it seriously because nobody imagined that a parent would say something like that if it were actually true. But in 1994, the police came to 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, and they started digging. And there, beneath the garden, they found Heather. Heather West was 16 years old when she was murdered in June of 1987 by her own parents, Fred West and Rosemary West. She was their eldest daughter, and she was allegedly killed after threatening to tell people outside the family about the horrific abuse that had been taking place inside the house for years. Her death was the last in a series of murders committed by the couple over a span of 2 decades. A killing spree that claimed at least 12 confirmed lives and turned their modest terraced home into a burial ground. Fred West was born in 1941 in the village of Muchmarcle, Herefordshire. Rosemary Letts was born in 1953 in Devon. They married in 1972 and eventually settled at 25 Cromwell Street, a narrow terraced house in a residential area near the center of Gloucester that would later become known across Britain and around the world as the House of Horrors. What happened behind its walls over the following 15 years is almost beyond the capacity of language to describe. The Wests tortured, assaulted, and murdered young women and girls, then dismembered their bodies and buried the remains in the cellar, beneath a bathroom floor, and throughout the back garden. Their victims were often young, vulnerable, and far from anyone who might notice their absence. The kind of people whose disappearances did not immediately trigger widespread alarm or sustained police attention. The confirmed victims at Cromwell Street included Carol Ann Cooper, who was 15, Lucy Partington, who was 21, Therese Siegenthaler, also 21, Shirley Hubbard, 15, and Juanita Mott, 18, all found buried in the cellar. Linda Goff, 19, was found beneath a converted bathroom area. Shirley Robinson, 18 and pregnant with Fred's child, Allison Chambers, 16, and Heather were buried in the garden. Beyond Cromwell Street, 8-year-old stepdaughter Charmaine was killed by Rose in 1971, while Fred was in prison. Her remains were found buried under the kitchen floor of the family's earlier home on Midland Road. Fred's first wife, Rena Costello, and his former mistress Anne McFall, who was 18 and pregnant, were found buried in fields near Much Marcle and Kempley, killed by Fred alone years earlier. The case broke open in 1994 when police received information that led them to take that family joke seriously. They obtained a warrant, began excavating the garden, and found human remains. The dig expanded into the cellar and throughout the property. As body after body was uncovered, the scale of what had happened became clear. They were not dealing with a single killing. They had found a graveyard hidden inside a family home. Fred West was arrested and charged, but he never stood trial. On January 1st, 1995, at the age of 53, he hanged himself with knotted bedsheets while on remand at Her Majesty's Prison Birmingham. Rose West was tried at Winchester Crown Court and on November 22, 1995, was convicted of 10 counts of murder. She received 10 life sentences. In 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw imposed a whole-life tariff, meaning she will never be eligible for release. Only the second woman in British history to receive such an order after Myra Hindley, Rose West still maintains her innocence and remains imprisoned at Her Majesty's Prison New Hall. 12 confirmed victims. A house where the dead were buried beneath the floors and the garden while life went on above them. A joke that turned out to be a confession. And a woman who helped carry out some of the worst crimes in British history and still insists she had nothing to do with any of it. 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996. The site is now a public walkway. But what happened there has never left the national memory, and the name West still carries a weight in Britain that no amount of time has managed to lift. The Wichita Massacre. On a freezing December night in 2000, a young woman walked more than a mile through the snow, barely clothed, to bang on a stranger's door. She was the only survivor of one of the most brutal crimes in Kansas history, and her courage in those frozen minutes would be the reason her attackers were ever caught. The crimes were the work of 2 brothers, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, who arrived in Wichita with long criminal records and, over a single week in December of 2000, embarked on a spree that left 5 people lost and others wounded. It is remembered today as the Wichita Horror, and it remains one of the most appealed capital cases in American history. How did the spree unfold? It began with a robbery in which the brothers forced a young man at gunpoint to withdraw cash from a series of machines, and continued days later when they fatally wounded a 55-year-old cellist and librarian, Anne Walenta, as she tried to flee in her car. She lost her life to her injuries weeks later. Each act grew bolder than the last, a city slowly realizing that something terrible was moving through its streets. But the central horror came on a December night, when the brothers forced their way into a home where 5 young friends were spending the evening together. What happened in that house? Over several hours, the 4 men and 1 woman inside were robbed, terrorized, and subjected to a prolonged and degrading ordeal, then driven to a remote soccer complex on the edge of the city. The details of what they endured are among the most disturbing in any American case, and they are best left unspoken. There, all 5 were fatally wounded and left in the freezing night, after which the brothers drove a vehicle over the scene in an effort to ensure no one survived. 4 of them, Brad Hake, Heather Muller, Aaron Sonder, and Jason Befort, did not survive. They had been ordinary young people, friends gathered on a winter evening, with no connection to the men who forced their way in. How did anyone get out alive? One young woman, known publicly for years only as Holly, survived because a small hair clip deflected the round meant to end her life. Despite catastrophic injury and the bitter cold, she walked over a mile to find help, gave descriptions of the brothers, and became the prosecution's central witness. Her identity was protected at trial, and it later emerged that she went on to marry the man the brothers had robbed at the very start of their spree. What happened to the cars? Captured within days, the brothers were convicted in 2002 on dozens of counts each, including capital homicide, and both received capital sentences. For the survivors and the victims' families, that should have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning of a legal saga that has now run for more than 2 decades. Why has the case dragged on so long? In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the brothers' sentences. But in 2016, the United States Supreme Court reinstated them in a near-unanimous ruling, written by Justice Antonin Scalia in one of his final opinions. The Kansas Supreme Court affirmed the sentences yet again on remand in 2022, and lower courts denied further motions in 2024. Where does it stand now? In late January of 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court heard fresh oral arguments, with defense lawyers arguing that confusion over how counts were numbered between the 2 phases of the trial had invalidated the sentences, and the district attorney dismissing the dispute as mere semantics. As of mid-2026, the court had not yet ruled, and both brothers remain incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. Kansas, notably, has not carried out an execution since 1965. And so, a quarter century on, 5 families still wait for a final word that never seems to come. The Wichita horror unfolded over a single, brutal week. The next case stretched its cruelty across nearly a month, in a flat decorated, of all things, with cartoon cats. The Hello Kitty murder. A teenage girl walked into a Hong Kong police station in the spring of 1999, tormented by nightmares of a headless ghost that would not let her sleep. What she eventually led officers to would become one of the most horrifying cases the city had ever recorded, and it would take its strange name from the cartoon decorations that filled the flat where it happened. The victim was Fan Man Yi, a young woman of 23 who had endured a desperately hard life. Abandoned as a child, raised in an orphanage, and pushed onto the streets as a teenager, she had struggled with addiction and was working at a nightclub when she crossed the wrong people. It was a small debt that sealed her fate. What set it in motion? Fan had taken a relatively small sum of money from a triad member named Chan Man Lok, who then demanded far more in return than she could ever hope to repay. It was, in the end, a trivial debt, the kind that should have been forgotten in a week. Instead, in the brutal logic of the world Fan had been forced into, it became a justification for something monstrous. In March of 1999, Chan, 2 other men, and Chan's teenage girlfriend abducted Fan and imprisoned her in a flat on Granville Road, a building that, by grim coincidence, was filled with cheerful cartoon cat decorations. What followed was not a swift crime, but a slow and deliberate one, carried out over weeks while the outside world had no idea she was missing. What happened in that flat? For roughly 4 weeks, Fan was held captive and subjected to relentless, sustained cruelty at the hands of her captors until she finally lost her life. The full extent of what was done to her during those weeks is among the most appalling on record, and it does not need to be recounted here. Afterward, her captors concealed her remains, hiding part of them inside a large Hello Kitty doll, the detail that would give the case its haunting nickname. How was it discovered? The crime came to light only because Chan's teenage girlfriend, who had been present during the ordeal and was haunted by what she had witnessed, walked into a police station weeks later. Officers, at first unsure whether to believe her, followed her to the flat, where they recovered the hidden remains, including the skull sealed inside the doll. Without that one young witness breaking down under the weight of her nightmares, Fawn might simply have vanished, another forgotten woman the city had never looked out for, with no one ever knowing what had become of her. Why were the men not convicted of homicide? Because so little of Fan's body could be recovered, the prosecution could not establish a precise cause, and the defense argued she had passed away from an overdose during her captivity. As a result, in 2000, the 3 men were convicted not of homicide, but of manslaughter, and each was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge described the case as involving a level of cruelty and depravity unlike anything Hong Kong had heard of in recent memory. Where does it stand now? 2 of the men, Chan Man Lok and Lung Wai Lun, remain in prison serving life sentences. The third, Lung Xing Cho, had his sentence reduced on appeal and was released after about 14 years. Fan's skull was eventually returned to her family and cremated, and the building where she was held was later demolished and replaced by a hotel, where small memorials are quietly kept. The case left such a deep mark on Hong Kong that it inspired films and shaped the city's true crime memory for a generation. Fan Man Yi was failed by almost everyone in her short life, and in losing it, she became a name the city could never quite forget. Remembered painfully, not for who she was, but for the cartoon doll that hid what was done to her. In the Hello Kitty case, there was no doubt a terrible crime had taken place. The next is the opposite, a loss ruled an accident, though many remain certain it was anything but. Phoebe Hansjuk. Concierge in a luxury Melbourne high-rise made a grim discovery one December night in 2010 at the very bottom of a 12-story garbage chute. How a healthy young woman came to be there has never been settled, and the official answer has satisfied almost no one who has looked closely at the case. Phoebe Hansjuk was 24, a former receptionist who was a keen climber and martial artist, living in an apartment in a luxury complex with her older partner, Anthony Hampel, the son of a prominent retired judge. The relationship was reportedly turbulent, and Phoebe struggled with anxiety and with alcohol. On the night she lost her life, those struggles and the unanswered questions around them would collide. What did the evidence show? Phoebe had been drinking heavily, and toxicology later found a sleeping medication in her system that had been prescribed not to her, but to Hampel. Forensic findings indicated she had survived the fall down the chute briefly before her injuries proved fatal. There was a further wrinkle that troubled the family. Police had classified the case as self-inflicted within days, before forensic testing was even complete. And Phoebe, an experienced climber and martial artist, was hardly the sort of person whose body simply failed her, which made the idea that she had drunkenly hauled herself into an overhead chute all the harder to accept. It was how she came to be in that chute at all that would become the heart of the dispute. Why is the case so contested? The chute hatch sat about a meter above the floor and was spring-loaded, meaning that entering it required deliberately lifting oneself upward into it. Investigators found no fingerprints on the chute or its hatch, no injuries to Phoebe's fingers consistent with hauling herself in, and the hatch appeared to have been wiped clean. There were also reports of bruising on her arms, of broken glass and blood in the apartment, and that her partner had eaten dinner and had a drink at the apartment after noticing the broken glass, before calling police. The coroner's own assisting counsel suggested an open finding was warranted, given everything that did not add up. What did the coroner decide? In December of 2014, after a contested inquest, the coroner ruled the case an accident, concluding that Phoebe had climbed into the chute herself while in a confused state caused by alcohol and the sleeping medication. Critics, including the family's lawyer and a major newspaper investigation, called the findings speculative, pointing out that the medication is documented to cause routine sleepwalking, like walking or driving, but not extraordinary feats, like hauling oneself into an overhead chute. The ruling, in other words, asked people to believe in a sequence of events that no one had ever recorded happening before. Did anything change because of the case? It did. The case helped prompt a review of how coronial findings can be challenged in the state. And in 2018, new laws were passed clarifying the appeal process for the coroner's court. It was a reform born of one family's refusal to accept the answer they had been given. There was also a chilling later footnote. Some years on, another young woman who had been in a relationship with Hampel was found lifeless at her family home hours after the couple broke up, in a case ruled self-inflicted but disputed by her family. No connection between the two has ever been established. But for those following Phoebe's story, the echo was impossible to ignore. Where does it stand now? Anthony Hampel was never charged with any offense relating to Phoebe's passing, and the case remains officially ruled an accident, with no further inquest or charges pending. Phoebe's family continues to campaign publicly, and the case was the subject of a major investigative podcast that re-examined every disputed detail. To this day, two utterly different stories sit side by side: an official account of a tragic accident, and a family's conviction that the truth was never properly pursued. Phoebe's case turned on a single disputed ruling. The next case involves at least a dozen in a different century, and a culprit who was never caught. The Torso murders. The man who had helped bring down Al Capone met his match in Cleveland, in the form of a predator who left a trail of bodies through the city's poorest district and was never identified. Nearly 90 years later, the case remains one of America's great unsolved mysteries, though modern science has only just begun to chip away at it. Between 1935 and 1938, an unknown predator took the lives of at least 12 people in Cleveland, leaving their remains in and around the impoverished ravine known as Kingsbury Run, near a rough district of bars, gambling dens, and homeless camps. The crimes were marked by a chilling brutality and a disturbing precision, and the victims, many of them drawn from the area's flop houses and transient camps, were people the city had largely overlooked even in life. That, perhaps, is part of why so few were ever identified, and why the case has lingered as a wound in the city's history. Who were the victims? Of the 12 recognized victims, 7 men and 5 women, only 3 were ever identified at the time. Many of the bodies had been treated with a chemical preservative and drained, leaving the remains in an unnatural, leathery state that deepened the horror as for investigators. In a desperate bid to put names to the rest, authorities even displayed a reconstruction of one unidentified victim, the so-called tattooed man, at a major public exposition in 1936, where more than 100,000 people viewed it. And still, no one recognized him. That a person could be so thoroughly erased, even with such a distinctive set of tattoos, said something bleak about who the victims had been and how little the wider world had known them. What was Eliot Ness's role? Cleveland's famous safety director, Eliot Ness, fresh from his triumphs in Chicago, took a personal interest in the case. In 1938, frustrated by the lack of progress, Ness led a controversial raid on the shantytowns of Kingsbury Run. rounding up dozens of men and burning the shacks to the ground. The raid was widely condemned, but strangely, the killings stopped. Were there suspects? There were two main ones. The first was a troubled surgeon, a war veteran who had performed amputations in the field, lived in the area, struggled with alcohol, and reportedly failed multiple early lie detector tests. Ness privately believed he was the one responsible, but he was never charged and spent much of the rest of his life in a veterans' hospital, reportedly sending Ness taunting postcards for years. The second was a bricklayer who confessed under questioning, then recanted, claiming he had been beaten, and who was later found lifeless in his cell in an apparent self-inflicted manner that an autopsy, revealing broken ribs sustained in custody, cast serious doubt upon. Was the bricklayer ever cleared? Yes. Decades later, after careful historical research, a marker was placed on his grave, posthumously clearing him of any involvement in the killings. A small act of justice many felt was long overdue. Where does it stand now? The case remains officially unsolved. But in 2024, the county medical examiner partnered with a genetic genealogy group to exhume some of the unidentified victims from a potter's field, beginning with the tattooed man. As of the most recent updates in late 2025, that testing was still underway, and no victims had yet been identified. One of the enduring puzzles is that the killings simply stopped after Ness's raid, as if the person responsible had moved on, been institutionalized, or passed away, leaving no further trace. The case has continued to grip the public imagination, inspiring books, comics, and screen adaptations. But the central question endures. Who was the figure who haunted Kingsbury Run? And why did the bodies suddenly cease to appear? After nearly a century, the people the perpetrator discarded may finally be given back their names, even if the man himself is now beyond any reckoning. The Cleveland Predator was never named. The next case is far more recent, and the mystery is not the identity of a culprit, but whether a passing the authorities called an accident was something far darker. The Tamla Horsford case. A mother of 5 went to an adult slumber party in a Georgia subdivision one November night in 2018, the only black guest among the group. By the next morning, she was found lifeless in the backyard, and what really happened that night has divided a community and a country ever since. Tamla Horsford was 40 years old, a beloved mother from Forsyth County, Georgia, a place with a long and painful history of racial exclusion, where black residents had been violently driven out generations earlier, and few had lived for most of the 20th century. She arrived late in the evening at a so-called football mom party, the only black guest among the group. And the next morning, she was found face down in the yard. That history, and the fact that she was the lone black woman in the house, would hang over everything that followed. What turned a private tragedy into a national controversy was how the investigation that came next was handled. What did the authorities conclude? The state medical examiner ruled the passing accidental, attributing it to multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a fall from a balcony combined with a high level of alcohol in her system. Toxicology also found a prescription anti-anxiety drug for which Horsford had no prescription. On that basis, the sheriff's office closed the case as an accident within months. Why did so many people refuse to accept that? Because of how the scene was handled and a glaring conflict of interest. The scene was not preserved as a possible homicide scene. Guests left before all could be interviewed, and unusually few photographs were taken. One guest's partner, who placed the emergency call, worked for the county court system and was later fired for accessing the case files from his work computer. And he was reportedly personally friendly with the lead investigator. To the family and to a watching public, it looked less like a neutral inquiry than like a circle of people who already knew one another closing ranks. Did a second opinion change anything? A second autopsy commissioned by the family documented additional cuts to her face, wrist, hands, and lower legs, along with an injury to her heart that the family argued were inconsistent with a simple fall. There was also the question of the anti-anxiety drug in her system, which one guest later acknowledged sharing with friends at the party, though she said she had not given any to Horsford. The competing findings and the unexplained injuries deepened the suspicion that something had been missed or deliberately overlooked in the rush to close the case. Was the case reopened? It was. In 2020, amid renewed national attention during a summer of protest, the sheriff asked the State Bureau of Investigation to take a fresh look, and an online petition gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures demanding answers. But in 2021, the state concluded its review, and the district attorney declined to bring any charges, again calling it a tragic accident. For a family convinced that the first investigation had been compromised, the second look brought no comfort and no closure. Where does it stand now? As of 2026, the case remains closed and officially classified as an accident, with no charges and no federal investigation, despite continued calls for one. A defamation lawsuit brought by several party guests against a friend of Horsford's who had publicly questioned the ruling was later dismissed. The case drew the attention of national figures and celebrities who amplified the family's call for answers, and the family's attorney has said plainly that he believes it was a homicide, but simply cannot prove who was responsible. For Tamla Horsford's 5 children, the official word is accident, while the questions about that night, about the unexplained injuries, the conflicts of interest, and the only black woman in the house have never gone away. Tamla Horsford's case is a question of justice that may never come. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next is a question of identity itself. A woman found burned in a frozen valley, who carried a dozen names and belonged to none of them. The Isdal woman. In November of 1970, a man and his 2 young daughters, hiking in a frozen valley outside Bergen, Norway, found the badly burned body of a woman lying among the rocks. More than 50 years later, no one knows who she was, and her case remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in Europe. Around the body lay charred clothing, melted bottles, an umbrella, jewelry, a half-empty bottle of Kloster liqueur, and sleeping pills. And crucially, every manufacturing label had been cut from her clothing and scratched off her belongings. Even the labels on the bottles had been removed. Someone, possibly the woman herself, had taken great care to ensure she could not be traced. The position of the body, in the so-called pugilistic attitude common to fire victims, and the items around her gave the scene the appearance of a deliberate, almost staged, end. What did investigators find next? 2 suitcases recovered from lockers at the Bergen railway station contained 8 false passports under different aliases, along with wigs, multiple sets of clothing, and currencies from several countries. A coded notebook recorded her travels through European cities, which investigators were eventually able to decipher as dates and the initials of places she had visited. Witnesses recalled a woman who had stayed at hotels across Norway under various names, spoke poor English, but was heard speaking German and what some thought was Flemish, had distinctive gold dental work uncommon in Scandinavia, and was sometimes seen with an unidentified dark-haired man. She had changed hotels frequently and requested room changes, behaving, witnesses felt, like someone who did not want to be found. How did she lose her life? The autopsy found she had taken a large quantity of sleeping pills and had also inhaled smoke, since her lungs contained soot, indicating she was alive when the fire began. In 1970, Bergen police ruled the case most likely self-inflicted, though that conclusion was disputed at the time, with a leading crime reporter stating flatly that he was convinced it had been a homicide. The careful removal of every identifying label sat very uneasily with the official theory. Why did the espionage theories take hold? Because of the Cold War setting, Bergen lay near NATO naval installations and a secret missile testing program, and a multilingual woman traveling under 8 aliases in that place and time looked to many like a spy who had been silenced. No espionage link has ever been proven, but the theory has never gone away either. What has modern science revealed? In a major reinvestigation around 2016 and 17, Norwegian and British broadcasters worked with police to apply modern forensic methods to her remains, which had been preserved since the original autopsy. Isotope analysis of her teeth concluded she was born around 1930, likely near Nuremberg, Germany, and had moved as a child to the French-German border region, while DNA analysis pointed to maternal ancestry from southeastern Europe or southwestern Asia. For the first time, a rough outline of a real life began to emerge from the aliases. Did the new leads identify her? No. A podcast on the reinvestigation generated more than 150 tips, and genetic genealogy specialists offered to help. But none of it has produced a name. A 2023 lead in a Swiss newspaper speculated about a possible connection to a Nazi-aligned banker. But it remains unverified. Where does it stand now? As of 2026, the Isdal woman has still not been identified, and the case remains officially open at the Bergen Police District. Investigators now have a probable birth year, a probable birthplace near Nuremberg, and a partial map of her ancestry. But not the one thing that matters most. Her name. The genetic genealogy effort that has cracked so many other cold cases has so far found no relatives to anchor her to. Whoever she was, whatever she was doing moving through Norway under 8 false identities, and whoever scratched the labels from her possessions, she remains, half a century on, a woman known only by the frozen valley where 3 hikers found her. The Isdal woman left a body, but no identity. The next case left 3 identities, but for years, no bodies at all. An entire family that simply vanished. The murder of the Jameson family. When hunters found the Jamesons' locked white pickup on a remote Oklahoma track in October of 2009, everything was inside. The parents' wallets and phones, $32,000 in cash in a bag beneath the seat, and the family dog, starving but alive after 8 days. Bobby, Sherilyn, and their young daughter were gone, and it would be 4 years before anyone learned what had become of them. Bobby Jameson, 44, his wife Sherilyn, 40, and their daughter lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma, and had been planning to buy a remote 40-acre plot in the Sans Bois Mountains, where they intended to live in a storage container. Bobby was on disability after a car accident, and Sherilyn had been hospitalized shortly before following a mental health crisis. On the 8th of October, the family was last seen driving toward the property. A man living nearby reported seeing them look at the land for about 15 minutes before they drove a short distance away and were never seen alive again. 8 days later, hunters came upon the truck. What did the security footage show? Cameras at their home captured Bobby and Sherilyn loading the truck in what investigators described as a trance-like state, making roughly 20 trips, sometimes carrying nothing, sometimes standing motionless with vacant stares. It is footage that has unsettled everyone who has seen it. A man living near the land later said he watched them look at the property for about 15 minutes, then drive off, never to be seen alive again. What was found in the truck? Along with the cash, phones, and IDs, were maps, a GPS unit, and a handwritten letter from Sherilyn angrily addressed to Bobby. A brown briefcase seen in the security footage, loaded into the truck by Sherilyn, was missing when the vehicle was found. The $32,000 left untouched ruled out any obvious robbery, and the malnourished dog locked inside suggested the family had not planned to be gone. Why a family that had loaded a truck and driven to remote land would simply walk away from all of it, leaving behind cash, phones, and their dog, has never been explained. How strange did the context get? Bobby had told his pastor the family was seeing spirits and asked whether there were special bullets to use against them. A so-called witch's Bible was found in the home, and Sherilyn had spray-painted a cryptic message about cats being harmed by people in the area onto the storage container. Bobby was also in bitter litigation with his own father, said by some to have ties to the local drug trade, and reportedly had a restraining order against him. The family had also evicted a roommate with extremist connections, and Sherilyn's name was said to have appeared on a list of targets. A photograph of their daughter was found on Bobby's phone, possibly taken the day before they vanished. Theories multiplied in every direction. When were they found? In November of 2013, deer hunters discovered the skeletal remains of 2 adults and a child lying side by side, face down, on a mountain about 2.5 miles from the abandoned truck. The medical examiner positively identified them as the Jamesons in 2014. But because of severe decomposition and animal activity, the cause could not be determined. There was no obvious trauma the bones could still reveal, no weapon, no scene preserved, nothing to confirm even whether all 3 had been harmed by another person. Where does it stand now? The case remains unsolved and officially open with the Latimer County Sheriff's Office. Theories range from a drug deal gone wrong to foul play by Bobby's estranged father, to the family being eliminated after witnessing something illegal, to the wilder possibilities suggested by the occult items in their home. A former sheriff has said he believes they were forced to stop and got out of the truck to meet someone they recognized. No one has ever been arrested or charged. The cash, the starving dog, the trance-like footage, and the bodies on the mountain remain a set of facts that no single theory has ever fully explained. The Jamesons disappeared in a single afternoon. The next victim was terrorized for nearly 7 years before her case ended in a verdict that satisfied no one. The murder of Cindy James. Over nearly 7 years, a Canadian nurse reported around 90 terrifying incidents. Threatening phone calls, slashed pillows, obscene messages scrawled on her walls, lifeless animals left in her yard, and several physical assaults on her person. Then, in 1989, she vanished and was found hogtied in the yard of an abandoned house. Her case ended in one of the strangest verdicts in Canadian legal history. Cindy James was a respected pediatric nurse in Richmond, British Columbia, who coordinated care at a facility for children with behavioral disorders, and who in 1982 separated from her husband, a psychiatrist many years her senior. Beginning that year, she reported a relentless campaign of harassment to the police, some callers reportedly growling threats of harm. The timing, beginning so soon after the separation, would later feed competing theories about who, if anyone, was tormenting her. The incidents escalated alarmingly over the years that followed. How serious did it get? She was found on more than one occasion injured or unconscious, including once in her garage with a stocking around her neck, once near her home unconscious, and once hypothermic in a ditch miles away, wearing a man's work boot and glove. She moved house, changed her name, and hired a private investigator, while the RCMP devoted enormous resources to the case. Despite thousands of hours of surveillance and an estimated $1.5 million spent, no suspect was ever identified, and no surveillance ever captured an attacker. Was she causing it herself? That became the central question. Arson investigators found that a fire she reported as a deliberate act had been set with the glass falling outward, consistent with self-staging, and the RCMP increasingly suspected she was behind at least some of the incidents. Her family and her private investigator rejected that theory completely, insisting she was a genuine victim being stalked by someone real. What happened in 1989? In May, James disappeared. Her car was found in a shopping mall parking lot with blood on the door, her groceries spilled, and her credit card lying underneath. 2 weeks later, on the 8th of June, her body was found in the yard of an abandoned house, her hands and feet bound behind her back, and a black stocking knotted around her neck. Toxicology revealed a lethal quantity of morphine and sedatives she had no prescriptions for. Yet no syringe was found at the scene, and she had no defensive injuries. How could she have bound herself that way? That was the impossible heart of the case. It was difficult to see how she could have hogtied her own hands and feet behind her back and administered a fatal dose with no syringe present. Yet equally hard to square the years of apparent self-staging with a genuine outside attacker. Both explanations required believing something nearly impossible. What did the inquest decide? A 40-day coroner's inquest in 1990, among the longest in the province's history, heard from more than 80 witnesses, including not specialists, psychiatrists, forensic experts, and her family. And the jury returned an open verdict. An end by unknown event, neither homicide, self-inflicted, nor accidental. The not experts testified about whether she could plausibly have bound herself, and no firm answer emerged. It was a formal acknowledgement that the truth could not be established to any legal standard. Where does it stand now? As of 2026, the case remains officially closed, with the RCMP holding to its staged conclusion and the family maintaining she was a victim, and no new evidence has emerged to break the deadlock. It became the subject of 2 books published in 1991, a network television program, and decades later, a multi-part podcast that revisited every detail of the 7-year ordeal. More than 3 decades later, no one can say with certainty whether Cindy James was hunted to her end by a phantom stalker no surveillance ever caught, or was herself the architect of her own terrifying undoing. Cindy James's case ended in a verdict of unknown event. The next case was caught, in part, on a surveillance video the entire world would come to study, frame by frame. The murder of Elisa Lam. In February of 2013, Los Angeles police released roughly 2.5 minutes of elevator footage showing a young woman pressing every button, peering into the hallway, hiding, and making strange gestures. Within days, the world was watching, and days after that, her body was found in a rooftop water tank above the hotel where she had been staying. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old Canadian university student from Vancouver who had bipolar disorder and a documented history of stopping her medication and experiencing episodes. Traveling alone, she checked into the historic and notorious Cecil Hotel near downtown Los Angeles in late January. The Cecil's grim reputation would only feed the speculation to come. What happened at the hotel? Lam reportedly left unsettling notes for her roommates and was moved to a private room, and she was removed from a live audience taping in Burbank for similar behavior. When she failed to check out as scheduled at the end of January, her parents alerted police, and her last confirmed sighting was at a downtown bookstore, where a manager remembered her as friendly and outgoing that day. Nothing in those final sightings suggested where she would be found, or how. Why did the case explode globally? Because of the elevator video, which police released in mid-February in hopes of identifying her movements. It went viral worldwide, accumulating millions of views and tens of thousands of comments within its first 10 days on one video platform alone. People parsed every gesture, convinced the footage showed her reacting to someone or something just out of frame. How was she found? On the 19th of February, after guests complained of low water pressure and discolored, foul-tasting water, a maintenance worker climbed to the roof and found Lam's body in one of the hotel's 4 large rooftop water tanks, with her clothing in the tank beside her. Guests had, by then, been drinking and bathing in that water for days. The discovery was so macabre, and the question of how she had gotten into a covered tank on a roof so hard to answer, that it seemed to confirm, for many, that something sinister had occurred. What did the official investigation conclude? The autopsy was initially inconclusive, and toxicology found prescription medications at low levels, consistent with her not taking them as directed, and no illicit substances or alcohol. In June of 2013, the coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. Investigators concluded she had most likely experienced an episode, reached the roof through one of several access points, and entered the tank herself, possibly removing her clothing as a response to hypothermia, then was unable to get out. The tank's lid and the difficulty of access fueled doubt, but no evidence of anyone else was ever found. What harm did the online speculation do? Enormous harm to innocent people. Internet sleuths fixated on theories ranging from the supernatural to outright homicide. And a musician who had stayed at the hotel a year earlier was falsely accused and harassed so severely that he later spoke of being deeply scarred by the experience. A widely shared coincidence that a tuberculosis test in use near the hotel shared letters with her name was just that, a coincidence. But it fed the conspiracy theories for years. The Cecil's own grim history, having housed several notorious figures over the decades, only made people more eager to believe the hotel itself was somehow to blame. Where does it stand now? A 4-part Netflix series in 2021 re-examined the case and ultimately endorsed the official accident ruling, while documenting the damage done to the people the internet wrongly targeted. The Cecil Hotel was later renovated and reopened as low-income housing, and the official ruling, accidental drowning with bipolar disorder a significant factor, stands with no criminal investigation open. What the world treated as an unsolvable mystery was, in the end, most likely the tragedy of a young woman in crisis, with no villain at all except the illness she could not outrun. Elisa Lam's case was ruled an accident. The last case was unmistakably a homicide, and yet, decades on, it makes no more sense than any case that was never explained. The Blair Adams case. In the last week of his life, a Canadian construction foreman emptied his savings, told his family that people were trying to harm him, and fled across an entire continent in a panic no one understood. He ended up lifeless in a Tennessee parking lot, thousands of miles from home, and nearly 30 years later, no one knows why he was there or who took his life. Blair Adams was a 31-year-old construction foreman from Surrey, British Columbia, who worked for his stepfather's company and was 2 years sober. In the weeks before his end, he began suffering mood swings and telling those close to him that people were trying to harm him, though he had no psychiatric diagnosis and would not explain what he was afraid of. His mother later recalled that he hinted at some secret he could not bring himself to share. What did his final week look like? It was a frantic, illogical journey. He withdrew nearly all his savings and emptied his safe deposit box of more than $6,000 in cash, jewelry, and gold and platinum bars, then tried and failed to enter the United States by ferry, turned back by immigration officials who felt he fit a drug courier profile. He quit his job, bought a one-way ticket to Germany, where he had recently been involved with a woman, then refunded it. He eventually crossed into Washington state on foot after a second border stop, flew to Washington, D.C., rented a car, and drove all the way to Knoxville, Tennessee, a city he had no known connection to. What happened in Knoxville? On the evening of the 10th of July, he locked himself out of his rental car at a gas station, insisting to the tow truck driver that he had the right key when he did not, and was dropped at a hotel. Surveillance there captured him entering and exiting the lobby 5 times in about 40 minutes, paying $100 cash for a room he never entered. The next morning, construction workers at a site across the interstate interchange found his body in the parking lot. 2 witnesses later reported having seen him with an unknown man outside a nearby restaurant that evening. What did the autopsy reveal? The cause was sepsis from an abdominal injury following a heavy blow to the stomach, and he had a forehead wound consistent with a crowbar or club, defensive wounds on his hands, and bruising consistent with being struck by a vehicle. The autopsy also noted possible indications of a sexual element, though nothing could be confirmed. This was plainly a homicide, not an accident or a self-inflicted end. What ruled out robbery? The fact that nothing was taken. He still had around $4,000 in mixed Canadian, American, and German currency, his passport, and a pouch containing roughly 5 ounces of gold and platinum bars and coins. None of it touched, which eliminated theft as a motive. The only piece of forensic evidence was a single strand of hair clutched in his hand, which did not belong to him. For a man carrying a small fortune to be left with all of it in a public parking lot told investigators that whatever had happened was not about money. Where does it stand now? The case remains unsolved. A DNA profile developed from that strand of hair has never matched anyone in any database, and a composite sketch of the man 2 witnesses saw with Adams that evening was never identified. There is no established connection between Adams and Knoxville. His mother once speculated he might have been heading toward the Atlanta Olympics that summer, but no evidence supports it. And theories range from an encounter that turned fatal to something tied to whatever he had been so afraid of. A cold case investigator has spoken of the frustration of reaching one impasse after another, and the Knox County Sheriff's Office still lists it as open. A man fled across a continent convinced someone was coming for him. And in the end, someone was, leaving behind a fortune in untouched valuables, a single strand of hair, and a terror he never explained to anyone. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.